There's an interesting set of questions we received which basically pertains to the way to prepare yourself to practice, how to practice, and then also how to look for the right environment for your practice. And as we covered most of those things in various talks, it would be a good idea to mention it all together in one specific talk, and then people who do go through our other recorded videos on YouTube, then they can also refer to those as well. As the question specifies, it says how to establish the right knowledge base for three things: reading suttas, develop a reflexive mindset, which is a mindset of mindfulness, and advice on entering a monastery, where you can obviously perfect these practices. So the first point is how to read the suttas correctly. It comes down to recognizing that whichever way you start, it will not be perfect, because you're already starting with all the wrong views, wrong assumptions, and then you won't be able to begin in a manner that won't be revolving around those. So the reason why it's important to maintain that as a context is because it will prevent you from drifting too far away from the original motivation that made you want to practice, which is suffering and freedom from it. So you recognize that it's your experience as it is at that very starting point. That's where the problem is. So then whatever you're learning through the suttas, through the instruction of another, as in the form of contemporary Buddhist teachers or whatever. The point is, whatever you're learning about it, you will then maintain the correct context in recognizing that whatever you're learning about it, it should be pertaining to undoing that wrong starting point of your state of Puthujjana. Otherwise, what's going to happen is, if you don't question your starting point, you will take for granted all of your attitudes and notions about the practice, about the things that you should be practicing with. You'll be taking them for granted as if they were not already affected with ignorance, and then you will be trying to build your practice on top of those, and that's why it won't work. So, for example, it's like say you come across the suttas for the first time and you start reading the translation of the suttas, which is, there's no problem there, but and then it talks about the consciousness, talks about the matter. See, the problem there is that when you think consciousness, when you think matter, when mind affected with ignorance thinks consciousness, that's not that which consciousness is. Or rather, it might be to some extent, but already those notions are the notions affected with ignorance. So instead of you thinking that you can understand the suttas just by figuring out, the relationship between consciousness or this or that, when you are thinking consciousness or form and trying to figure things out on account of it, those terms are already the terms that are affected with ignorance. So that's a very important point here. It's the practice, the direction of the practice is the direction of undoing your current understanding, the understanding at a starting point of what consciousness is, what your experience is, what the relationship with others, with greed, aversion, delusion are. So it's not about finding the secret that's been hidden away from you. It's really removing the assumptions and notions and significances that you yourself have been maintaining that have been obscuring the nature of those things. So the nature of those things is properly understood, not at the end where you figure it all out, but in the very beginning, basically when you undo all the wrong notions that have been covering it up. If you keep that in mind, then the attitude of reading the suttas will be much, it won't be too wrong to begin with. So when you're reading something about consciousness, or reading about, or any sutta, whichever sutta you're reading, or whatever it might be about, you will then maintain a notion that if you truly understand the sutta, you will be at least a Sotapanna. If you fully understand and develop that, the sutta, and fully then develop the understanding, you'll be an arahant. So when you have a notion that you understood the sutta, that is absolutely fine, because you probably did understand it to some extent. But unless then you know for sure that your understanding is on the level of freeing you from suffering and preventing you from being able to suffer even amidst things that used to cause you suffering. So unless your understanding has reached that level, you shouldn't really be content with it. You shouldn't really think that you understood it. Because understanding, if done rightly, results in freedom from suffering automatically. So that is always your criteria to go back to. And then the efforts towards contemplation of understanding the instruction, clarifying, getting the meaning of the instruction for practice, those efforts should be then revolving around, not, as I said, not figuring it out as something you're missing out, but more like questioning the things that you are using to figure these things out. So when you are thinking about what is the nature of, what is like a nature of anatta, for example, when you say to yourself, okay, anatta means this, maybe you consult Pali, consult other translations, and then you get the idea of what anatta is. But instead, using that idea to sort of arrive at some conclusion, you really want to keep questioning that idea as much as you can and go in the opposite direction. Not to arrive at a conclusion, but undo any assumption you have about it. So you can literally take any Pali term, for example, and reflect on it like that, any relevant Pali term. So if you take, let's say, for example, rupa, in the suttas it means form, it's translated as form, as matter, sometimes means body. So do you know what that means? When you yourself, in your own experience, when you say rupa, when you say matter, or whichever your native language is, whichever word you would be using, instead of assuming that you already know what it means, what you designated with that word, start questioning it. So when you say like consciousness, like unconscious, what does that mean to you? Can you describe? Can you see what is it that you refer to when you use a designation called consciousness? What are you referring to in your experience? Because you must be referring something. Otherwise, that word would be completely meaningless. All the words would be completely meaningless. So that's how you should be reading the suttas as well. You read a sentence, you read it too, you kind of understand it, but then see how deeply can you question that understanding while you're reading that sutta. When the Buddha paints a scenario of like a young man, subject to this, subject to that, he does this, and then he goes forth, and then you take every individual sentence and then reflect on it in the direction that I just outlined. Question it. So when it says in the suttas, young man experienced dissatisfaction with life, am I experiencing dissatisfaction in life? Why do I take for granted that I already understood properly what dissatisfaction for life is? I mean, sure, I might have understood it to some extent, but what is it to say? Am I able to say correctly that I understood it to the same extent like this young man in the suttas that the Buddha referred to? And then you question it. So don't take it for granted. So even for things as generic as dissatisfaction with life, you can exercise the same reflexive sort of contemplation and questioning, let alone then for the more specific terms like anatta and dukkha and all those other key phrases from the suttas. So that's how you come to understand them. It's discerning them, removing the gratuitous assumptions, so you get to discern them on the level of your own experience, because these things are universal. The suttas are basically just the most accurate descriptions of the universal aspect of every human experience. That's it. So whether they were spoken 2.5 millennia, or they were spoken 5 millennia ago, or if they were spoken 10 years ago, if they were spoken correctly, they would have always been pertaining to the same universal principles. Which means it doesn't matter how much time passes between the utterance of the suttas and one understanding them, one will be understanding the same things. And even the Buddha himself could not have done things differently. He himself said that all that the Tathagata can do is uncover the universal truth, the universal path that has always been there, just been covered up, like a jungle overgrown the old ancient path. So keeping that in mind then, you realize it's not about it arriving at something you're missing out, it's really uncovering the place where you begin your practice from. So you want to practice now, the direction sort of collecting information from out there, that's all fine, you need to know what you're at least supposed to do. But then once you start doing it, it's basically about questioning the assumptions that you already have in regard to things that you are using for your practice. So when you say, when you read a sutta about meditation upon certain types of perceptions, you start asking yourself, okay, perception. When I say perception, what am I referring to? Am I referring to sight, sound, smell? How does that, what are the characteristics? What are the signs and tokens, as the Buddha would say, of those things that I will automatically take for granted if I start looking at the answers that will be provided for me? But it's not about the answers, it's about questioning the premises of your questions, even before you arrive at any answers. So with that kind of attitude, the suttas will then start to serve as basically not as some sort of informational instruction, but as a direct, most accurate, most immediate description of the universal aspects of your experience here and now, of everyone else's experience here and now, be it in the past or in the future. Because that's how accurate suttas are, but the reason why one is not able to understand them to the point of developing the right view is because of your own wrong views and wrong assumptions. So wrong assumption about consciousness, about the five aggregates, about everything that you read in the suttas. Most of those things already are infected with your own assumptions. That is your starting point. So it's not to figure out the secret that's contained in the suttas, it's basically undoing your assumptions about the concepts that you read, and that's how you then get to understand what those concepts refer to, what their nature is. And that's why in the suttas you get sometimes a person literally hears a sentence from the Buddha or two and immediately becomes a Sotapanna. It's not because he was so lucky and the Buddha sort of planted the truth in his head with using his psychic powers. No, he said himself, the Tathagata cannot do the work for you. He can point out the way. If you make the effort, you'll arrive at the right view and arahantship. If not, you won't. Doesn't matter what the Tathagata says. So the reason why those people would need such a little amount of instruction is because they did not carry all these wrong assumptions in regard to the terminology that they just heard Buddha utter. So that explains all those cases when, like, people upon hearing one sutta, that's it, they became arahants. It means they already done the work of removing these assumptions, or certainly haven't done the wrong work of accumulating these assumptions. So how far your assumptions have been accumulated, you can't tell. The only way to know that is in hindsight, once you have undone them. So that's how you should read the suttas. So the second point then is how to develop how to practice mindfulness properly, how to develop that reflexive mindset. In brief, the fundamental attitude for properly practice mindfulness is being aware of the motivation behind your current actions, whatever those actions might be. It's not about attending to your body, observing sensations and whatnot. It's really maintaining that background knowledge of what is currently happening to you, which always involves a degree of your action to some extent. So that's the basic principle. Mindfulness is simply asking yourself, what am I doing right now? What am I doing right now? You will already know what you're doing without needing to stop doing what you're doing. So the mindfulness is on the level of discerning that knowledge that's already there. That's why if you do mindfulness correctly, it is effortless, as we spoke so many times. So the reflexive mindset then is the mindset that keeps watchful eye not on the immediacy of your experience, as in I'm touching now my legs and I'm sitting and I'm leaning. You don't need to be saying all those things because you're already doing them. All you need to do is find the elevated ground from which those things will be seen without needing to directly stare at them. And that elevated ground is the motivation behind your current action. Or that elevated ground can then be rooted in anything else that acts as a basis for your action, where your motivations are rooted. Body postures, current moods, feelings, and so on. So it's the important thing is to realize that it's not about trying to catch a moment and be so attentive to one moment so you don't miss anything out. The point is actually completely the opposite. direction, which is direction of knowing what you're already doing without needing to directly attend and keep telling to yourself what you're doing, because you already know what you're doing. That's the key here. You're not fabricating that knowledge, you're discerning it as already being there. And without that kind of knowledge of what's already happening to you to some extent, doesn't mean you fully understood it, but means there is already a degree of some recognition. And that's basically what mindfulness is. That's why you can't have too much mindfulness. You can't have too much of a recognition of what's already happening to you, what you're already doing, what you want to do. And that's also why, if you practice mindfulness like that, it will become impossible to not see where things that you're about to do, where those things are rooted. You won't be able to mistakenly or carelessly engage with unwholesome. You will only be able to do so volitionally, knowingly, because now you know. That's why ignorance is the most fundamental. Ignoring, choosing to ignore what you know, choosing to ignore what's already there, choosing to ignore the certain motivation behind your action that you know is actually rooted in desire or ill will and so on. And you will be able to maintain that kind of choice of ignoring because you haven't practiced mindfulness sufficiently enough, you haven't developed it. But if now your standard is to never be completely ignorant of your current situation, current motivation, current actions, means you will never be able to fully, completely commit then to choosing to ignore it so that you can follow your desire, your ill will, and distraction. And that's the key here. All of those unwholesome things are always rooted in your intention to do them. You can't accidentally do things rooted in desire, aversion, and delusion. That's why you are responsible for it. That's why the Buddha would say things like, you must then avoid everything unwholesome and then cultivate the wholesome. That's the key. It's rooted in the knowledge, it's rooted in recognition, and that's why ignorance comes first. You can only ignore something that's already there. You can't ignore things that don't exist. So a certain recognition exists, but you choose to ignore it. And that's why a person is fully responsible for avijja. Avijja is not on the level of a metaphysical secret that needs to be figured out. Avijja is the most immediate attitude that you have towards your own experience as a whole. Attitude of ignoring it. That's it. Attitude of taking for granted there isn't desire, there is an aversion, and so on. By doing actions, by performing actions rooted in attitude of ignoring your own experience, that's how you maintain the ignoring of your experience. So first, you need to practice sense restraint, physical restraint, develop virtue, as in stop maintaining the wrong attitude through those unwholesome actions, and then you can develop proper mindfulness of that attitude, because it is already there. Whatever you're doing right now, the motivation to do that, the intention to do that is simultaneously present with it, on that level of the knowledge. I still have an intention to carry on sitting here and answering these questions. Once that intention changes, as in once I decide not to do it anymore, I'll stop doing it. And now I don't need to be thinking about how am I sitting and how my back is touching the chair and so on, because all of those things are already contained within the intention to do this action. So that's pretty much the only place you need to keep your eye on. You don't need to monitor and try to catch all of these little things that are happening around you and control them. No, you just need to keep an eye on peripherally, just be aware with the corner of your eye on that point where the action is rooted, which is in the intention for that action. So if my intention changes and starts going into something unwholesome, I would see it even before you even start doing anything remotely unwholesome. And if you see it as on the level of that possibility of unwholesome, means it's not on you. So it's enough to recognize it at that level, and you won't be acting out of it. If you choose to act out of it, it cannot be accidental. You will do so intentionally. And that's the thing. The more you develop mindfulness, the less able you will be to intentionally engage with unwholesome actions. That's why literally the Buddha sometimes to some people, this was so clear to some people that the Buddha, all he needed to say was avoid everything that you know to be unwholesome and cultivate everything that you know, as in you're aware of it with the corner of your eye, you're seeing whether the intention is wholesome or unwholesome, and cultivate everything that's wholesome. And that's it. people contemplated like that, practiced that kind of attitude and became arahants. Because you cannot have greed, aversion, delusion persist in your mind unless it's being maintained, unless it's being perpetuated and fed with bodily action, verbal action and mental action. So once you have uprooted the intentionally choosing those types of actions, these things will have to fade away out of your mind. They cannot remain there. Whether you want it or not, it doesn't matter. That's the similar what the Buddha said, if a hen sits on her eggs, even if she doesn't wish for her chicken to pierce through the shell safely and come into this world, they will, because she's sitting on her eggs. And if the other hen doesn't sit on her eggs, even if she wishes, oh, may my chicks pierce out safely, they won't, because she's not sitting on its eggs. So even if a monk wishes that his mind be purified from unwholesome, it won't be unless he's doing the work. If he's doing the work, even if he doesn't wish that his mind result in liberation and purify from unwholesome, he will, because he's doing the work. So that's the reflexive attitude. Just keep a corner of your eye to whatever you're currently doing, wherever your current actions are rooted in. Whether it's passively enduring things done to you, experiencing, witnessing, whether you're actively doing, fundamentally there is a certain intentionality involved in all of that, and that's on the level of knowledge. You already know what your situation is, to put it in a most general term. That's why body postures are kind of natural anchors, as in natural foundation for whatever's happening to you. So whatever's happening to me now, it's on the basis that this body is seated. So you don't need to be attending to seated body, you just need to know that you are already seated. And then that knowledge endures. You don't need to keep repeating, I'm seated, I'm seated. What am I doing now? What's my body posture now? It's seated. Okay, so now there's this knowledge that I have established by answering it, and this knowledge is still here, and we can talk about different things now, we can address different topics, but a corner of my eye is still kept on the basis of the background that this body remains seated. So whatever happens to it, it will happen on the basis of being anchored in the seated position. That's it. So you want to actually, you don't want to keep repeating and telling to yourself, I'm seated, I'm seated. You want to bring your mind to it, sure, discern it peripherally, and then let other things occur. Let your mind go without you losing the sight that you're still seated. So the key is to start discerning that relationship between things you're attending and the background those things are rooted in, inevitably, whether you want it or not. So I'm still seated. So my situation of having a seated body while we are talking about all these things has remained unchanged for like, what, half an hour now, 20-something minutes? It has remained unchanged. And your awareness can then come and go from it, but all you need to do is keep the like 0.1%, literally, of the background. It's just not completely drift away. And if you do drift away, you can recognize yourself for as long as the body remains seated, because the anchor has remained unchanged. So then, in other words, your forgetfulness is going to start being included in your mindful situation that you have established with the knowledge of it. Because lapsing of the mind, as in attention sort of going, and then losing sight of itself, is inevitable. That's how the mind works. But it's when you remember, whether you will remember on the wrong basis or on the right basis. If you remember on the right basis, that's what I mean when I say you will start forgetting things mindfully. In other words, you can only forget the content of the experience, not the nature anymore. And that, if you fully develop that, the mind will be impenetrable. There will be absolutely no greed, aversion, delusion left in it. That's the mindfulness developed to the extent necessary for the final knowledge, as the Buddha would say it in Satipatthana. That kind of knowledge will then be understood and discerned as more fundamental even than your act of forgetting this or forgetting that. So your forgetfulness, your act of forgetting, will be mindful. You will do it mindfully. And you do it mindfully, not when you overly attend it and try to control it. You do it mindfully where you become unable to misunderstand it. That's it. Unable to infect it with your wrong assumption. And that's pretty much all to it. Once your behavior has been restrained with the rules and virtue and precepts, you don't want to be over-committing in trying to control the content of your thought or of your actions. You actually want to be discerning the intention simultaneously present with those things. So I'm still seated and we're still talking about it, and it's still the same mindfulness or the same knowledge of the same seated position enduring all this time. And now if you have doubt, for example, oh, but is it not? That doubt cannot actually do anything to the seated body. Because for as long as the body posture remains seated, the anchor of the discernment remains unchanged. So it becomes impenetrable to doubt as well. Doubt will penetrate it, whereby you start doubting it and then you stand up and then you start doubting, what am I doing? But again, even that, it's you will intentionally choose to give in to trying to appease the doubt, as opposed to not give in and maintain the knowledge of the peripheral situation that has remained unchanged. So you go beyond doubt when you stop feeding the craving towards the doubt, not when you find a perfect answer that will appease the doubt once and for all. Doubt is an attitude in regard to the content, which means nature of that content is inherently impenetrable by that doubt. But you are the one who chooses to ignore that and feed the doubt by trying to provide the answers that doubt is pressing you towards. That's why doubt is a hindrance. And if you stop feeding it, it will stop exercising power over you. Same as any other hindrance, actually. That question was the, choosing the right environment, the right monastery, and so on. You have to recognize the limitations of lay life, the constant bombardment of engagements and other people and company, how to maintain solitude and so on. So if you choose to stay a layman or laywoman, you have to take up responsibility for it, which means you have to take up responsibility for limiting the extent you can develop your practice. You just can't do it in such an environment, only to some extent. Like back in the day when lives were not so bombarded and sensuality was not so accessible, it was still hard. Like back, you read it in the Suttas. People could get the right view and so on, but even back then it was hard. Imagine today when everything is like a finger click away and constantly, massive people live in massive cities with loads of constant crowd in apartments, just constant company. Even if you're not necessarily perceiving it directly anymore, it's there. It's part of the significance of the society that you live in. So you have to recognize the limitations and then take responsibility for it. Then you can't really complain if your practice is not really developing to the extent you wanted to, because you chose to stay in the environment that is such. Having said that, now that doesn't mean that get into a monastery will be a solution in itself either. Basically, monastery is just intensifying environment for the work you need to do internally. So if you're not doing the work internally, it doesn't matter if you spend the rest of your life in the monastery, you won't get anywhere. So sometimes people think that if all they need to do is find a perfect monastery, then the practice everything will fall into place and they'll just be sailing. But that's completely not the case. So the suitability of a monastery should be measured to the extent of whether you are able to maintain the virtue, as in whether the community is keeping the Vinaya rules, to the extent of whether you are just constantly engaging with lay people and constantly sitting in the organized groups and crowds and community meetings and community things and doing things together, or whether you actually spend most of the day left alone, as in solitude. Doesn't mean left alone without any instruction and so on, but means like whether most of your time is within the environment that will provide a physical solitude. Now, sure, there are things occasionally you come together, but you want sort of to constitute a minor part of the day. Even if everybody is perfectly silent and mindful, the fact is you're surrounded physically by others. There's perception of others, and because of that, the mind won't be developing notions and signs of solitude that are necessary to discern the sign of the mind that is necessary to discern the right view and sotapatti. So the criteria for then the right place are relatively general. So the good Vinaya and solitude, everything else in between, when there is a will, there is a way. Things are not perfect. You could still make it work as long as these fundamental principles are not compromised. So it's important to really see that there is no such thing as a perfect place, because you have absolutely no criteria what perfection is. You're only the criteria of Putujana who starts practicing, or even somebody who's practicing longer or something but who's not Sotapanna. The criteria is this pleases me and this displeases me. as the suttas often say. So you shouldn't really be trusting that if something is pleasing to you, that means that it's right, or that if something is displeasing to you, it means that it's wrong. Nobody denies that you will be experiencing things in such a manner, but instead of just taking for granted your attitude towards it, question it. So if there is something displeasing to you, start questioning. Why is this? Did the Buddha say this is wrong? Or why am I finding this displeasing? Or are my ideals that are not matched by all these things, are my ideals right? Is this behavior against the Vinaya? Is this environment against the practice? Maybe. If so, then okay, you got your answer. If it isn't, then so why is it still displeasing to you? Because people, everyone's mind to some extent will be looking for faults in things as well. So you'll be looking for faults which will be revolving around your conceit. So that's why that self-honesty has to be important. And even if things are overall displeasing to you, unless the criteria of Vinaya and solitude are compromised, then you really should try and work with it, as opposed to just going from a monastery to a monastery or a place to place, or refusing to commit to it because you still haven't found a perfect situation. Yeah, you'll never will, because the perfect situation will be created from the inside on a certain sufficient basis. The perfect situation won't be found outside. Otherwise, all you need to do is get to a monastery to become an arahant, and everybody would be doing that. So I think that kind of sums up in general the attitude towards the suttas, the attitude towards mindfulness, which is necessary for discernment, and then tailoring that those criteria towards search for the right environment. Even if you don't necessarily commit to the monastery, you can certainly simplify your life as a layman. Start keeping the precepts, reduce the amount of time you eat per day, don't eat for beautification, don't eat for the pleasure of the taste, but literally measure, recognize the necessity for macronutrients, for health, for strength, for endurance, and then meet the macronutrients in the most efficient way, and micronutrients as well for that matter, but let's not get into that now. But the point is, don't just, you could practice lots of restraint, you could set up relatively sufficient environment, unless you're already committed to life in terms of family and everything else, in which case it will be even harder. But you could set up even your lay environment to a great deal by simplifying your life, and that can certainly help you then, and offer as a kind of a transitional step if you're still unsure whether you want to join the monastery and so on. Yeah, being aware of your situation will then enable you to judge these things rightly and practice sense restraint accordingly.